All right, true believers, we're back for part 2. And so you remember our drawing of the cow skull. I've just added a little bit more detail to it. Mostly I've darkened it. I've added a lot of good charcoal to it so I can really darken it. I've also added the eyeball in there and done a few corrections to it. So now's a good point to find us a nice juicy brush. And I'm going to take advantage of my sable here. And the beautiful thing that I like about charcoal is that it's wettable. And so as you're basically adding water to the charcoal, it begins to soften. And you'll really see it as I start to add it to the horns. So you can begin to manipulate it just like it's, a type of ink. So what I'm doing now is I'm really pretty much adding water all the way around to soften up my background, all that tone that I added in there. You'll find that the more charcoal you added up front, the more you have to play with, the more you have to manipulate. So I haven't really messed with the skull too much just yet, except for the horns. But I'm defining the image again by defining the negative space around it and also creating a much softer tonal value for the background. In the background, you hear one of YouTube's bossa nova mixes. And I'll go in and I'll start messing with some of these nice darker values. So also too, this is handy if you weren't able to get ink from me or if you've run out. You can see that basically all I've done here is I've manipulated charcoal and water. So basically pigment is pigment, and all I'm doing at this point is now I'm defining my values. Anything that I want to be something other than white, I'm taking advantage of popping that in, and I'm using now my brush and my wet charcoal, sort of like a wet medium. Hang on, let's get rid of the add. All right. And so you can see here, basically, I haven't hit any ink yet. All I've done is just worked off of the charcoal that I added to the page at the initial drawing stage. I'm also going to add a little bit to that eyeball now, just to start establishing values. And so it's starting to get a little fun. And so now's a good point where I can start playing with my ink a bit as well. So let's see the brushes I want to use. I'm going to start making a little bit of wash too. So you remember from before, we're basically sort of diluting the ink in various stages, trying to get more of a sort of wet Kool-Aid effect. And so these horns are already wet, so for fun I'm going to go on and continue adding really nice wet ink to them. Let them bleed a little bit. So now what we're doing is basically we're layering that ink right on top of our wet charcoal. So it gives a like wet on wet effect, which is really kind of fun because remember your background is a little wet as well. So even over here you can see I've got a little bleed, which is really okay. That's kind of adding to my effect. I use a little bit of my ink just straight out of the jar. So the rules of value still apply. We're still thinking about our values. We're still thinking about our chiaroscuro, our darks and lights, even though we're working in a darker medium. What I'm using now too is I'm taking advantage of the ink and those washes now to really just beef up my charcoal drawing. Okay. That was an alarm. Normally that would be the end of class. So I'm also too going to use some of my wash to sort of reinforce the values in the skull now also too, as well as unifying it with what had been happening in the background. And so again, shameless plug. Hang on. Not for Disney Plus. That wasn't it. Hang on. Let's get rid of the commercial here. All right. But shameless plug for those really nice sable brushes. I am using a sable here. And I'm finding that I can get like most of my work done with it because it keeps a really good point. So again, something to consider as, again, you guys are maturing in your practice. Certainly you deserve good quality brushes. And then you'll be able to be an old lady like me telling your students about how great the brush is that you bought when you were a young 20-something. Of course, I'll take excellent care of it. Again, public service announcement to keep your brushes nice and clean. I'm just going to soften some of this area around here, just to unify the figure and the ground in the background. Alright, I'm going to use a little bit more of that wash in here, really now just to contour the form, to give it some sort of sense of shape, you know, and sense of three-dimensionality, which hopefully will help make the realism a little bit creepier. And so don't be afraid as you go to add more wash. I'm really kind of fond of working into my washes when the paper is still kind of damp. So it's not a full bleed, but it gives me a lot of nice, you know, enough of a bleed where it gets, you know, just nice and interesting. I can really begin to manipulate my tones, almost like I'm working with a marker. So oftentimes I may take an area and actually sort of apply a very thin, delicate wash to it, knowing that I'm going to come back to it and add a little bit more to it. Not a bad idea too. Notice here I'm working those outer contours as a way of helping to establish that negative space as well behind my form. And it's good to think about your positive and negative simultaneously, you know, as you're creating, because remember that negative helps define that positive. So far from being about creating just outlines around your form, you're thinking about how you can use that negative space and that definition to actually help let it be the contour. So oftentimes I may add a little water when I want to soften up contours or soften up a tone. I'm going to put a little bit more ink on my palette, as well as a lot more wash. So now I've got a lot to play with. Remember too, try to get, if you're going to work with multiple washes, get a decent amount on your palette. I'm going to move these two brushes here. So again, this is my number 8 red sable brush. A brush that's probably older than a few of you in the classroom, but again, a testament to a brush that's been well loved and well cared for. So happy to be able to trot it out. So I'm going to come in now, and some of these areas are still a little damp, but the nice thing about that is that it gives you some of the flexibility that you're accustomed to in working in charcoal, and that you can start building it up. And it's soft enough, the bleed is soft enough to make your drawing interesting, but not so much where it just bleeds all over the place. Sometimes too, just the water that's in your pan, I call it like the dirty water effect basically, can be used as a tonal value. This is just wash that came out of my little washing jar that I clean my brushes in. So it's giving me a nice base tone, and I like it, so I'm going to stay with it. That's going to be kind of like, almost not quite a highlight tone, but certainly a base level tone. And what I like about playing with that is that with that sort of semi-damp paper, I can come in and really just gently build up my tonal values. Again, working wet into wet, not completely juicy wet, but wet enough to begin actually establishing some tones and having some fun with it. Again, have fun, forgive yourself. This is sketchbook work. And I did that so that it wouldn't be all pressured, because I recognize it's new media for you, for many of you. But again, I strongly, for those of you moving not only in graphic design, but also your manga, your anime people, learning how to manipulate ink you'll find will be a very handy career skill. It'll be very, very handy for you. Learning how to do it, reasonably convincingly. What I'm going to do just for fun is I'm really going to use my darker washes, the darker value washes, to come in nice and wet and really just juice up this background. So practically taking it almost completely out of the tube to just really give me that, fright effect. What I'm going to do to soften it is just come back just with water and manipulate it. As well as using water just around the edges just to soften that. What I'm going to do too is I'm going to dry brush. What I've done is I've dried my brush out a little bit so it's just damp, and I'll use that to get rid of the ghosts around my ghostly image. Remember, just like we did in working in charcoal, you can kind of work right into your form to kind of minimize those funky lines in between, that funky sort of white ghostly line. I'm going to use this actually to just build up the sides of these contours while I'm at it. And I like this sort of drippy stuff that's happening here. So I'm going to accent that a little bit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of water here. You see how it ran down? And I'm going to take a little ink and just add that right to the horns. And you can see how you get that sort of funky spread. That's like some of the joy of wet into wet. I've got a little drip here. I'm going to catch that while I'm here. Again, public service reminder, India ink does not come out of your clothes, nor does it come out of your brushes. Do not let it dry on either. So while I'm in here, I'm going to take my nice dry brush and kind of sketch my color in. Again, blending that positive into my negative and, making it a little bit more believable so it's not just cut. And then while I'm here, I'm going to go on and actually beef these values up because that part of the drawing is recessed a little bit. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on this other side. Just sort of basically introduce all this really beautiful, juicy, dark value here. Coming right out the jar, boosh. And you see how you can just manipulate that wet on wet to really get really fun, drippy effects. So allow some of that drip to happen. Just be careful that it doesn't drip on your clothes. So again, that's where having those paper towels on hand are kind of handy. So I'm just catching enough of the drip there without, killing the image too much. And again, I'm coming back in with fairly clean water just to soften up my gaps, bridging up my gaps between the positive and the negative. So that you can see even here on the camera how that ghost image pops in. So what I'm aiming for here is to just come right back in. Touch right up to the form itself. Don't be afraid to get a little ink on your form. It's an ink drawing. Okay. Coming up under here. I'm just going to add a little bit of water in here just to see what happens. And I'm going to pick up some of that extra drip. That's a little more drip than I need. And I like what's happening with that. I like some of that smeary fun effect that's going on in here. I'm also going to take a moment too and darken in some of the darkest parts of the mouth area just to help give it extra bit of emphasis. As well as establishing a little bit of contrast around the teeth. And again, I'll soften those areas by just dry brushing with a little clean water. Now I really like all that sort of drippy stuff that's coming off. What I'm going to do one more for the Gipper 2 is get a little bit more of that ink right out of the tube and hit the horns again. As well as in here, just sort of getting that really lovely wet and wet effect. So there's an element of chance in this kind of work. You almost don't know, it's like the proverbial box of chocolates. You don't know quite what you're going to get. Let's see. Now I'm going to take a chance and I'm going to flip my drawing a bit. Not too much because I don't necessarily want everything to drip backwards. But what I want to do here is I want to go on and the same dark treatment I've given the negative space, I also want to do that above the top of the skull. So easier for me to do that while the piece is upside down and let it drip towards what's eventually going to be the top of the drawing rather than doing it the other way and letting it all drip into the skull itself. So a little planning, a little forethought is in order here as well, folks. And again, I'm just gently manipulating these edges so that they blend right into my positive form. I'm also going to take a little bit take a moment to get rid of the commercial. And also grab my towel and take up some of this excess, some of that excess drip. I have a sheet of newsprint up under me to help catch some of that dripping. And again, I work on the very thick, sort of the watercolor paper, the thickest paper you have in your stack. If not, if you don't have that, then you're perfectly free to work with your sulfite. You'll find that it's going to buckle up on you some. Now, I know when I turn it right side up, some of it might drip, and I'm going to allow that to happen. Meanwhile, I'm going to come in and soften up some of my edges in between. Because again, creepy, you know, the drip is kind of part of the creepy effect. So I'll allow some of that to happen. And see if I can show it to you without the glare. And so the horns are starting to lose some of the definition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait for that to dry a bit before I go in any further. And so I'm going to shut the video off at this point so I can load it. We're about 20 minutes in. And so in part 3, we'll give this some finishing touches. That'll give this a little bit of time to dry, and then we can take it to a final finish.